Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us in this hour. I know you have lots of items on your magnets on your compass, so it's really nice to see so many people here. There's a new word in the social science lexicon. It's called alt-cred. Alt-cred. Maybe it's common parlance for many people in this room, but alt-cred, alternative credentials, right? And the value of alternative credentials is that their study is incredibly nascent in the social sciences. Now, I don't want to wish social science on anyone or anything, but I will say, as I've said to Deborah Quazzo several times, alt-cred is the Wild West. And ASU+GSV is Main Street in a frontier town where there's no hospital, no fire department, no city hall, no pharmacy, no planning department. And that's what's fun about the Wild West. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of business opportunity, a lot of philanthropic opportunity, lots of enthusiasm of connecting people, jobs, and education in new ways. And one of the things I love about coming to Main Street here is there's a lot of optimism at ASU+GSV about this frontier that many of us are helping to build. But like any frontier, there's also a great deal of risk in this uncharted territory. A great deal of risk for public capital, for private capital, for philanthropic capital, and also for the men and women who we imagine will be investing in new kinds of learning opportunities in new ways over the course of their lives. And the purpose of this session is to continue a conversation that convened with modest funding from the National Science Foundation in July of 2022. If any of you have received conference funds from the National Science Foundation, you know that it's about enough money to put 24 people in a DoubleTree hotel in Bethesda, Maryland for 1.5 days, right? But because we couldn't do that, but also because the ambition of this particular conference was to seed a national conversation about how different kinds of sciences could be built to map that Wild West, not tame it, but to map it and inform people who are investing their money and their lives and their policies in this new world of learning opportunities and mobility. We convened a discussion with about 250 people over 4 sessions on consecutive Wednesday afternoons in July. I actually still have money remaining in the budget. That's how affordable this critter was. Really the goal, like I said, has been to find ways for different kinds of researchers to work in tandem with the myriad organizations that are represented at this conference, to think about ways in which we could build cumulative knowledge that could help providers produce better services for working adults whom they're seeking to serve, for state legislatures to inform policymaking, for entrepreneurs who are seeking to develop new kinds of learning opportunities, and ultimately to federal government agencies and future presidential administrations for how the world that is so vividly assembled here in San Diego, how this world is going to be appropriately scaffolded and supported by public as well as private entities. And so in the spirit of just continuing that dialogue, and with thanks to Deborah, actually, who attended our convening and invited us to have this session, I've invited 3 of my colleagues from different parts of the education ecosystem to provide some responses and reflections on this work. There's quite a few copies, but not enough maybe for everyone, but you can find the whole document at workinglearners.stanford.edu on the web. It's a document that comprises 9, hopefully non-complex recommendations for how this terrain might be mapped. In anticipation of this conversation, the 4 of us had a great call recently, so I'm very much looking forward to this dialogue. And we're going to be sure to have time for question and answer and comment in the effort of just continuing a conversation. For again, I wouldn't wish science on anything, but if you could have any science you wanted, right? To serve working learners, what kind of science could and should we build? That's essentially a way to have the conversation. So I'm going to let each of our participants introduce themselves to give you a sense of who they are and what they do and for what organization. I'm going to ask Amy to introduce herself first, Amy Smith to introduce herself first, then David Porcaro, then Peter Blair. And then they're each going to make some provocative contributions to the conversation. We'll have some dialogue, and we'll save about 10 minutes for discussion at the end. Okay? All right. Amy.
Thanks, Mitchell. So hi. Good afternoon. Amy Smith, Chief Learning Officer of StraighterLine. StraighterLine is an online alternative credit provider, and our core competency is we offer 60 general education courses to everybody from 16 to 86 years old and everything in between. We've been doing this for a little over 12 years, and last year we had 45,000 individual students complete a StraighterLine course. So I always say our core competency is adult learners and how they actually learn. So that's us. Thanks.
I'm David Porcaro. I'm the VP of Learning and Innovation at General Assembly. General Assembly just had its 10th birthday last year, if you can believe that we've been talking about boot camps and all this stuff for about 10 years now. We have tech training courses for people all over the world. We have, global offices, and we work with all sorts of industry leaders in training, upskilling, reskilling their staff and tech careers. So.
Hi, everyone. My name is Peter Blair. I'm a professor at Harvard University and also a research affiliate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. At Harvard, I'm one of the faculty co-directors for the Harvard Project on Workforce, which brings together folks from our business school, our School of Government, and also our School of Education. And we're trying to think about ways that we can produce the kinds of scholarship that would equip policymakers, academics, and also learners to think very critically about the future of work and the ways in which we can rewire the workforce so that we can have skills and shared prosperity for all.
So Peter, we're talking about a population that Opportunity at Work calls STARS, skilled through alternative routes, and that our convening described as working learners. They are 2/3 of the American workforce, and these 2/3 of the American workforce are people who do not enjoy the categorical, multifarious privilege that comes from possession of a 4-year college degree. And our discussion is one of many ongoing conversations about the extent to which that 4-year college degree has become a dividing line of opportunity in the United States that is too fateful, too cruel, too expensive to adequately provide opportunities for the other, literally 2/3 of the working population in the United States. You've thought a lot about this population. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's important to think about stories. We all are motivated by stories and dreams, whether it was Dr. King's dream that helped us as a country to move towards racial reconciliation. And I think it's important for us to name this population of adult workers appropriately so that we can think about investing in them. I'm an economist, and economists typically refer to people with college degrees as being skilled, and those without college degrees as being unskilled, right? And so when you say that someone is unskilled, that's an essentialization of that person. And that normatively makes you think that, why should I invest in somebody who is unskilled? And so instead, we say that workers are skilled through alternative routes. We all know that having a job gives you the opportunity to learn. So for example, I have a PhD from the Wharton School. Before I became a professor, I had never fully taught a class. And so getting the job as a professor gave me the opportunity to learn how to teach. Shh, don't tell anybody, right? And for each of you in the room, think about your first job. Did you know everything that you needed to know to do that job? Probably not, but somebody taught you. And that's what we want to do, is to say, let's try to look at the skills that people learn on jobs where they currently are located and identify opportunities for them to transition to higher wage work based on those same skills, and also think about the workplace as a place for both learning and earning. I want to end by saying that each of us knows a star. I want you to pause for 10 seconds and think about somebody in your life who has completed high school but not college. And think about the skills and the competencies that they have. Like, I think about my brother Paul, who finished high school but does not have a college degree. But Paul is an incredibly skilled person in terms of doing construction-related work. We need to think about ways of valuing the skills of people who don't have college degrees, of stars, and then creating pathways through the labor market for them. And that's what this report that Mitchell and his team has put together. It's about helping us to think about how do we create a science that we can understand the ways in which this population of workers learn. And my colleagues here too are implementing that through their respective companies, and so thank you for the work that you're doing.
So, Peter, I need to make a confession and then ask you a brief follow-up question, which is, as part of this project, I was asked, in fact, to put a media company into contact with a population of men and women who sort of fit the description, who fit the service category here, right? The target of our discussion. And I was humbled to report that what sociologists call social closure is so complete that I knew nobody as a personal friend, right? I knew a lot of people in an employment relation, but I knew nobody as a personal friend who did not have at least a 4-year college diploma, right? That is the extent to which 4-year college degrees sort and stratify and segregate Americans, right? So my question, Peter, is why has it taken social scientists so long, right, to turn our attention to this vast population?
When you think about the people who are in positions of authority, oftentimes those people tend to create structures that will allow people who are like them to then rise up through the rungs. And so that's one of the reasons why we need to make sure that stars have opportunities for higher wage work. And if we look historically within the context of the United States, you go back to, say, for example, my parents' generation. Many people in that generation, they had very good jobs. They could be managers at a factory with a high school diploma. But as we've had more people get into college, we've forgotten that college is not the only pathway for getting these kinds of skills. And so it only takes us going back into the recent past to recognize that skill development happens on the jobs. And I think that that's crucial because what it does is it makes companies own the fact that they're responsible not just for the productivity of their workers, but they're also responsible for making their workers more complete and more skillful people too. And so that's an important part of the equation.
Thank you. Mr. Porcaro, and I must confess, David and I are at work on a potential research joint venture between Stanford Lab and General Assembly. So we've been talking for quite some time.
Well, first I have to admit, as we brought up the statistic I went through in my head, and 2/3 of my family, of my siblings, are skilled through alternative. So that I think that ratio probably holds pretty true to if you were to go and look through your own world. I am an applied learning scientist. That's what I do. And so, as we were having conversations about this report and about this area of adult learners, we're realizing there is extremely limited amount of learning sciences or economic or sociological sciences that we can bring to bear to be able to build programs. We don't know, is 12 weeks the ideal amount of time to be able to prepare someone? We don't know what is the pathway from novice to expert in these fields. We don't know what differentiates a junior employee from a mid-level employee. Sometimes we don't know what it means to take someone who's a subject matter expert and make them good teachers or good mentors. There's just so many things we have guesses, we build products around them, we make value propositions, we market those as being really beneficial, but we have absolutely no outcomes on this stuff. There's no regulatory bodies on here asking for this data, asking for these outcomes, and so there's just very, very, very little research here. So one of the things I'm really excited about this report is the beginnings and the seeds of infrastructure. And when you look at students who go through programs like General Assembly, they're going in and out of systems, right? So they start in the military, and then maybe they go do community college, and then maybe they tried a 4-year college and then move back to another institution, and then maybe they tried GA for a little bit, and then they did some workforce learning program. Like, they're going in and out of these systems, and we don't have a really good way of tracking students across that journey, because once they enter in a new program, like, anything that happened before is just completely veiled in terms of data structures and being able to know what barriers to improvement, who's making it through with what supports, who's not, which of those supports are limiting various populations. So there is just so much opportunity for a shared science. That's why I'm excited about the makeup of this panel. It's practitioners and academics, right? We're coming together to say, hey, I think we can work together on this. I think we can create really great ways of pulling that data together in a way that's actually pretty easy to get. It's not as hard as you think. Like, just scraping LinkedIn and looking at where people have been going over that time. These are just opportunities that exist. So.
And I'm going to have a follow-up question in that regard, David, but I want to sort of emphasize also for this population just how blind federal agencies are flying at this moment, right? If an organization does not take funds from Title IV of the Higher Education Act, right, like Pell Grants or subsidized loans, the federal government knows almost nothing about those programs, right? And their cost, their content, the men and women who attend them, returns to those experiences. So if there were to be a presidential administration that were going to ask Deborah Quazzo and her colleagues, what sort of federal policy we should build, right? There's no public data that describes this population. So I don't know about you, but I find that a little bit sobering. That and ultimately, I think a lot of that means a lot of risk for all of us who are working in this sector, whether as entrepreneurs or philanthropists or educators or scientists. That said, we are also living in a world in which straighter lines and general assemblies are vital providers of educational opportunities and spectacular aggregators of data, right? So we could say the glass is half full, half empty, in that there's very little public knowledge about this population, but there's a great deal of information and research opportunity that is housed in organizations that aren't schools, that don't want to be schools, that don't want to take Title IV money, right? And so one of the things that we talk about is, what kinds of relationships could we build, right, that would be sufficiently mutually beneficial, that GA would take the risk of doing research, right, with a third party that it doesn't pay, right? And it's kind of different. I just want you to know it's kind of different when you're doing research that you haven't paid for. Because you can't really control the message that way. And the news might not always be good. Have you noticed how much good news there is at ASU GSV? All of the numbers that should be going up are going up, and all of the lines that should be going down are going down, right? That's not the research that we're talking about, right? We're talking about research, right, in which failures, non-findings, null hypotheses, surprisingly bad outcomes are to be expected, right? That's what it means to do science, right? So that's a very risky proposition, right, if we're living in a world of all good news, right? And so a lot of the conference was focused on, well, how could we create a world in which, it would make sort of reasonable sense for a firm, not a school, to engage in that kind of research. And David, how are you guys thinking about that? Or you personally, if you don't want to speak on behalf of GA?
Yeah, I mean, I'm extremely excited that our legal team, CEO, the PR and outcomes people are like, yeah, go into this. We're excited about seeing these things as well. So, I'm very fortunate to be at an organization that does that, because I have been at organizations that don't, right? They're very guarded in that area. What's also interesting is that you talked about the aggregation aspect of it. Students who are coming through different parts of this journey might be using this third-party content or this third-party tool, or linking to we're working with this employer who's using this HRIS or this LMS, and we start to see how those are useful in different ways. And so, there's a lot you can say. Part of the reason, honestly, why I came to GA is I said, hey, look, we actually own the whole journey from the moment a student starts exploring till they're in their job and even beyond. We have relationships with these students for the first couple of years, in a lot of cases through apprenticeships and other programs, and you can see that journey. And we have access to all of it. And very few of the places in this gathering, people are like, oh, I own that part of the journey, and I own that part of the journey, and I can't actually, if I could connect these two pieces together, I could tell a more complete story. So I'm really excited about the ability to tell that more complete story through partnership and research.
Thank you. Amy?
So let's take that whole student journey, and StraighterLine doesn't do the whole student journey. So at StraighterLine, part of our DNA is we often sit back and ask, what's not on the page? What's in the margin, right? What's just not there? And so one of the key questions we asked last year was, so who does go to school as a working learner, adult? And who stops? Who starts? Why do they go? Why do they restart? Why do they stop? Do they finish? And how do they? So we really dove into that question last year, and it was a great research study. But that led to what's next, right? What else are we missing? So StraighterLine has the honor and the privilege. We partner with over 150 universities. So we get to watch much of that student journey. But we're only a piece of the journey. We're maybe the end when you forgot to take that econ class as a senior and you're trying to graduate. Some of us all have those children. I see some nods. Or we're the, can I go back? I'm not really confident. I stopped out for a long time. I'm a working adult. I need to come back in. Or the, you know what, I can't get that course in my schedule, so I'm going to take it at StraighterLine, and I'm going to do homework at midnight on Saturday, because that's how I'm going to get this done. So what we are is, we're not quite a gap filler, but we help you get that journey. So their second lean-in series of questions that we're really beginning to study are what we call swirlers and dippers. So the research, and this is really great new dissertation research is coming out saying a lot of working adults swirl, meaning they may go to several institutions, like true institutions. I started at a junior college, got a little bit here, exactly what Dave was just describing. Here's my military work experience, I took a CLEP exam, and they're sort of cobbling together whatever that credential is. But they're gonna figure it out, and the journey's long, windy, and completely non-linear. The second thing we're really learning is there are the dippers. Okay, I'm on a journey, and it might be a credential, it might be a boot camp, it could be a degree-seeking program, but I'm gonna dip over here and go take one of these and transfer it in. So I have a home base, but I'm gonna use all these alternative credentials and alternative ways to gather learning to get to my goal. So we're leaning into the swirlers and dippers, and we're trying to ask the next round of questions are stop-outs and dropouts real, or is that the wrong vocabulary? That's probably the wrong vocabulary. So if that may not be the right vocabulary, what's the new set, and how do you take the workforce vocabulary with the academic vocabulary, honestly, with the commerce and the government vocabulary, put all of those together and come up with the definition of how we really look at it all, and collectively. And then I'll say one more thing, I promise I'll pass it back.
Please.
Promise I will. So as both David and Peter had mentioned, where's the infrastructure? So back to StraighterLine's DNA. Part of our DNA is we look at what's not there, what's missing. So infrastructure's missing, you both mentioned it, thank you. But then I also think, where's the vessel, where's my go-to vessel? Like when I want to think about higher ed, I check HEDL. Of course I do. Online, I'm going to read the Chloe report every year. Of course I am. National Clearinghouse, this is my starter shop, right? Where do I do that in workforce? I don't. It's not there. So not only the national scientific research agenda and the infrastructure, but then how do you disseminate it and where's the place you go to get it? That's, I think, a key missing need, and that's something we're leaning into at StraighterLine.
That's hugely helpful. I have the privilege of working at a pretty good university, and Peter works at a pretty good university too, or people think we're pretty good. and at some things, right? We historically are not good at educating at scale, at low cost, or at transparently measuring learning. We don't do any of those things, okay? So don't look, my dean's in the audience, just so you know, right? So don't look to places like Stanford and Harvard to provide low-cost, accessible, well-instrumented learning opportunities, because that's not what we do, right? But we do some other stuff, right? We train people really well in specialized fields, basically almost every specialized field of knowledge. We do that really well. We do research in virtually every domain of knowledge simultaneously, okay? Like art history, aeronautical engineering, and astronomy. We do that all at the same time, right? Now, and so that's a huge capacity if you want to do sort of long-term science projects, right? So, I mean, there is capacity that places like Harvard and Stanford and Michigan and Irvine, and I'm sure there are others represented here too, right? But in my view, they've been spectacularly underutilized, right, by the alt-cred world, right? I am one of quite a few people, right, at your place and mine, who are trying to think about, well, how could we be of service to this sector? And so I would ask the two of you, from the standpoint of the organizations you work for or have worked for, like, what would you do with a pretty good training and research university? Like, how could we be of service to the work that you do in your organizations?
There's a lot of things. And we've had some conversations about what some of those might be, right? Some of it is answering the questions that I said. Some of it is helping to build an infrastructure. So we had shared taxonomies and shared standards around these and shared metrics and being able to drive that conversation and getting the policy around that and getting people who are going to listen to the research institutions. And, it's... I'm trying to remember if it was in this report. I think it was, yeah. It was talking about the role of research institutions, the role of community colleges, the role of state colleges, and the role of non-credentials, right? Each of them plays a different role. And you have to involve them all in this conversation. And, I recently came from a philanthropy organization, and when we were talking about who do we give our money to in these sorts of places, do we give them to the state colleges? Do we give them to the community colleges? Oftentimes it was, we should give them to the Stanfords and the Harvards because they're driving the conversation. They can bring along other people with them into that conversation. You can build consortia and stuff like that. So there is some value in that. And then also, I'm just selfishly going to say I hire graduates from Stanford and Harvard as learning designers, learning scientists who can translate across those worlds. And there aren't that many of them. It's really hard to find people who can speak academese and product development at scale, right? And so being able to have a really shared pipeline of the kinds of people that we can hire and bring into this conversation is another thing I would turn to your institutions for.
So I would say, I would agree, so thank you. What would be in my wish list, like what's in the candy store of what you're really ultimately asking? I think a couple things are really key. One of the first things I think of is we are walking databases. We are hundreds of thousands of data points, and it just lives there. So I can mine the data, but here's the thing. Am I asking the right question? And that's actually where you come in. So a great research institution, for example, can help us figure out and shape what should we be looking at, in what ways, for whom, and why. Always cutting edge. So it's a little bit about the research agenda, but it's also, honestly, it's the QA gut check of, are we asking the right questions? Yep. Are we asking the questions that the workforce community, that ecosystem is ready to hear? Because then if they're ready to hear it, they will consume it. Again, it's back to that, if you're out way ahead, the world may not be ready to listen to the message. So we're that database. The second thing I think about is anytime you're doing research, rarely do we do research in isolation. We don't do it alone. So more minds are always, put a lot more smarter people in one room, you always come up with a better idea, right? So we need really good partners, not only to help us construct and conceive, but also to examine, right? And we are And we're entire ecosystems of data. And it's very rare somebody knocks on the door and asks to mine it. It's very rare as a learning scientist somebody comes and says, so Amy, how do you know your students are engaged? And well, A, what's the definition of engagement?
Yeah.
Really, right? But B, how do I know when Amy's actually starting her class? Oh, I can actually look at that. And I can look at that for 30,000 people in algebra. That's powerful. So there's the place of help us figure out what we should be asking and make sure we're asking the right stuff, help us study it, and then help us get that word out and make sure that it's the right moment in time for the conversation.
That's great. Peter, I'm going to want to give you some more opportunity here, and then we're going to open it up to the room for Q&A. We're talking about a project that you can find at workinglearners.stanford.edu if you're new to the room. And I'll say that when you ask your question or make your comment, I'm going to ask you to stand up and introduce yourself in the spirit of community, and we will get a microphone on you. So, Peter.
Mitchell, this question is really personal to me because I got my start at a community college. And then I had the privilege of going to several elite universities, Duke, Harvard, and Wharton. And then I taught at a public institution, Clemson University, when we won several national championships in football, go Tigers. And now I'm back teaching at Harvard. And so I've really seen higher education in all of its instantiations, and it helps me to appreciate the value that each of these institutions brings in the populations that they serve and the way in which they can connect. I will say that something that's unique about Harvard is we have an extension school that provides for continuing education, and we educate like tens of thousands of students each year. And so the infrastructure at Harvard already exists to be able to do this. The second thing that I think we do very well is we have a lot of convening power to bring together the relevant actors. And some of that is because of the name recognition of Harvard, but a big part of that is because of our alumni. And many of our alumni, they go into the community and they develop programs that end up serving the least of these in all the different corners of the earth too. And so I think in terms of our pedagogy and in terms of our kind of like missional sending out, we have a great opportunity to train people who are going to go and do that work. But also we need to bring in partners from other institutions using the convening powers that we have. And I'll turn it over to you, Mitchell.
And amen on Harvard Extension. 3 cheers. Glad you corrected my error there. Okay, so please, comments, questions from anyone. And if you want to direct it to one of us, please do that too. Yes, sir, in the front. And then in the back over there. Please.
Hey, I'm Pierce Henderson. I'm a knowledge analyst and learning designer at the Boston Consulting Group. And Peter Blair was my professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. But you know, I think this conversation really resonates with my background. I started at art school before I then pivoted to the education space, and so being able to connect these different skills for me has been sort of crucial in my role now as a consultant and analyst and designer. But anyways, my question's kind of different. It almost seems like the velocity of change within the workforce space and innovation seems to outpace what longitudinal studies require. And thus, how do you like reconcile these two different speeds in order to codify or, I guess, create some structure in order to build this science?
Great.
I can jump in quickly. I think this is one of the reasons why we need to think about workplaces as also places of learning, right? Because if you think about when your boss comes and says, Pierce, I need you to do X. Immediately you go and you figure out, how am I going to learn that? And I think to the extent that we can make workplaces places of learning, we can shorten the time scale that's needed for folks to reskill.
And I'll just add, one of the points from the report is that you need different layers of research. You need a micro layer, a meso layer, and a macro layer. And within that macro layer, obviously, those are going to be big longitudinal studies that are going to take time and require the diligence and rigor that come with that kind of a study. With the micro layer, like there's learnings happening every day if you're instrumenting this right and doing continuous improvement and being able to do that kind of product development research and stuff that you're seeing on the marketing side or on other, how you design your website, that we can apply those techniques to, are these the right skills? Are the employers feeling happy about what we're giving them? And let's change our curriculum. And so there's that level. But also there are some fundamentals about learning that don't change. People want to feel a sense of belonging. People want to relate to other people. How do we build that? Like, those things aren't going to change just because you're learning Python instead of Ruby, right? Like, those things are going to be fundamental and will not change.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Ildi Laskakur, I'm a co-founder and CEO of Urbit Learning, and we're creating a SaaS product for K-12 schools to develop and retain their teachers. So I've attended almost every workforce session at GSV so far, and I'm sort of shocked by the fact that one of our largest workforces in education, the teaching workforce, doesn't really come up a lot in the conversations that we're having around learning and development. And so I'm just curious, obviously we have tons of data about who are in our classrooms, how long they stay, how quickly they leave, and why. And that's the place where we're passionate about. But I'm just wondering, why isn't anyone talking about the teaching workforce?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about that. One of the innovations that happened during the pandemic under our dean at the Grad School of Education was we launched a part-time master's program that was fully online. And it was incredibly successful in the sense that it drew in people who were career teachers and principals who, because they were already in very senior positions or they had families or other commitments, they couldn't commit to coming full-time to Cambridge, Massachusetts for a year to do the program. And we've continued that program past, like even as we're coming out of the pandemic, and it's been terrific because not only do we attract a population of teachers who can rescale, who can upgrade their skills, but also build community, but they're learning things that they can implement in real time in the classroom, right as they're teaching and as they're learning too. I have a student, for example, who's in Hong Kong, and she's able to come back to me in office hours and say, Professor Blair, like this model that you talked about, I shared this with the other people in my team. And so that's one thing that we are doing, but you're absolutely right. We have to think about our teacher workforce as our first line of defense, because if we can get it right for our educators, then then we can get it right for others. That's my fundamental belief.
Hi, Kenneth Gonzalez. I'm president of Dallas College. In Dallas, Latinos are 40% of the population, whites are 23%, blacks are 21%. So in terms of the science of workforce learning, where this is going and how do you incorporate not only the Latino population, but also the community college sector as you're doing this work?
So one of the things the report discusses and that we were just really talking about are that multi-layers. So the community colleges live, we think of them sort of at the macro, the meso, and the micro. They live at all of the levels, really. So the beauty of the community college ecosystem in the United States is it's been serving working adult learners. That's its premise, quite frankly. So I want to say forever, but it really has. And it has an institutional body of knowledge that doesn't live anywhere else, right? So it has to be at the table. So I would argue that it is part inherently of all three of those layers, but that's how I would start. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add one of the things that's really important as we're building this science is that there isn't a what works in education. I'm sorry to disappoint you, there isn't a what works in education. There's what works in Dallas, in the Dallas Community College, and we need to figure that out. And how is that different than what happens in Austin and what happens in Houston? Those are totally different environments with totally different contexts. There's some principles that can apply and generalize, but there are regional variations and there are local variations that need to be a part of that science.
Others? We have time for one more, maybe? Yes, please. How about say your name and comment, and also say your name and comment, and we'll get more voices that way, please.
Yes, Alec Campbell with Bisque Education. It's an OPM, Florida-based OPM. We're talking about workforce learning, but in order for someone to actually be enabled to learn while working, they need to first have a job, right? And that leads us into a discussion of the murky world of job search and recruiting. And if anyone's gone through a job search process of late, it's just an awful world, right? We have these job postings where the recruiters are saying, we get 500 applicants, but we don't get a decent candidate. And yet you've got the candidates who are filling out multiple applications only to get absolutely nothing back in terms of feedback of what they're missing in terms of skills, credentials, experience, no feedback mechanism there at all. What are your thoughts on how the education component breaches this problem in the job search, this inefficiency in the job search and recruiting space?
Thank you. And one more.
Thank you, Stefan Wisbar-Lectorio. Just a brief question on assessment. Like, the whole education system still seems fundamentally quite heavily oriented towards summative assessment points, a lot of cramming before those assessment points, and then a lot of forgetting after. So in terms of the learning science aspect, does that come into the way you try to design your interventions and the research and so on to maybe change that and optimize that?
And I'm not going to let anyone answer those questions because our time is up. But I want to thank you for continuing the dialogue. We can answer them down there. And I want to thank my colleagues for making this such a generative discussion. Thanks, everyone. Bye.